Okay, let's get started. Welcome to our event today about the decarbonization pathway of Turkey for net zero in 2050. My name is Ümit Şahin. I'm the Climate Change Studies Coordinator at Sabancı University, Istanbul Policy Center. And today I will try to present you our new study about decarbonization pathway of Turkey. The half of our team, actually, not all, but half of our team also in the Zoom. You see Ebru Voyvoda and Borakat from ODTÜ, Orta Teknik Üniversitesi, and Osman Bülent Tör from EPRA. I think Kemal Bey will also come later on from GT Carbon. This is our modeling team, so they will answer your questions. And also we have Volkan Bey and Gökşin Bey here from A+ Energy, and they will also present another study about coal phase out for Turkey. Okay, let's begin. Paylaşabilir misiniz benim sunumu? Okay. Thank you. I'll try to summarize main findings of our study today. And why this study is important, because it's kind of a unique study for the roadmap of Turkey, what kind of a roadmap Turkey should take to achieve net zero carbon target in 2050. As you know, Turkey ratified Paris Agreement 1 month ago and declared its net zero target in 2053. We started this study last year, almost 1.5 years ago, to model this change. What would happen if Turkey gets 2050 net zero target? So it's quite timely to present the results today. So in our study, the main assumption is 1.5 degrees. So all our studies are compatible with 1.5 degrees. And also we study CO2, not other greenhouse gases. As you know, the emissions should be halved in 2030 and to get down to zero in 2050 globally, in order to achieve net zero 1.5 degree actually, with 50% chance. And this is what we call net zero actually. So it's not a real zero, not an absolute zero. So in 2050s, this pointer doesn't really look there, okay. So it's not going directly to zero in 2050, but the new technologies will provide negative emissions, hopefully after 2030s. So globally, this orange part in the positive side, you see the CO2 emissions. So with the removals, we are hoping to balance anthropogenic emissions and anthropogenic removals. So this is the logic of our study. And if we really achieve globally net zero target in 2050, we still may go up to 1.5 degrees, but then the Earth's temperature will go down. So there will be a cooling after 2050s. So 1.5 target will be achieved. For Turkey, Turkey's greenhouse gas emissions, as you know, increased 130% since 1990. But the last 2 years, you see a small decrease. So it means that Turkey's CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2018. So this is very important for our study. You will see later. And in terms of how to break this line down, you need an assumption. And in some studies, you put some assumptions first and you try to find out what emissions you will get in 2050, for example. What we did is opposite. So we assumed in 2050 a net zero target. So we assumed that we achieved net zero target in 2050, and we modeled this 30 years from today to 2050. For this, we used carbon budget. As you know, in the carbon budget, so some of the slides here are Turkish, sorry for that, but just to show you the number here, that according to IPCC 1.5 special report, from 2018, the carbon budget is 580 gigatons. But in the Paris Agreement, there is no any clear rule how this will be allocated to the countries, how this 580 gigatons of carbon budget will be allocated in a fair share and in terms of equity. So there are some rules in IPCC, and there are some studies based on IPCC rules. We picked this one, the Paris Equity Check. You can always Google it and can find the methodology. It's based on scientific studies. And there are 5 categories about fair share. This one, this CPC, means cumulative per capita emission equality. So it's based on equality principle of IPCC. And in this methodology, in this approach, let's say, if a country has less or more cumulative carbon, historical cumulative carbon emissions, then these countries get less share from the carbon budget. If a country like Turkey has less historical responsibility, less cumulative carbon emissions per capita, then these countries get more share from a carbon budget. So in our approach, we used CPC approach, and at the end, with all these calculations, Turkey's allocation is 7.95 gigatons from this 580 gigatons of carbon budget. And this corresponds to 1.37% of global carbon budget. So from here, you can see that because Turkey's annual share in the emissions, global emissions today is 1.2%. So we give more carbon budget to Turkey than early industrialized countries or countries with more historical responsibility. That's important. So, so what we try to do in the model, we try to stay inside this 7.95 gigatons. In this study, we included all carbon dioxide emissions from electricity sector, transportation sector, buildings, energy-related emissions and process emissions from industry, and energy-related emissions from services and agriculture. And we used 2 basic scenarios in our study. The baseline scenario does not see any 1.5 degree target, etc. Baseline scenario is only based on the macroeconomic assumptions in a normal international economy and Turkey's economy. And net zero scenario assumes the same macroeconomic assumptions plus some interventions to go down to zero. And as I said before, our assumption is to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And the net zero scenario is until 2050, of course, but in the baseline scenario, we studied a little bit longer. So we studied the next 50 years, so you can see the next 50 years. These are the models. We used 4 models. We used macroeconomic model, electricity sector model, buildings model, and transportation model. And all these models are in interaction in an iterative way. They verified each other, etc. So all the professors and experts behind this model are here in the Zoom today. So If you have any detailed question, they can answer about the model. But one thing I should emphasize here, that electricity demand projection is the central part of the assumptions here. And as you know, from transport sector, from buildings and from industry, one of the main intervention is electrification. So this increases the electricity demand at the end. So we included this increased electricity demand to electricity sector model. So it's always working like this. So all the results you will see includes this impact of electrification. Let's see the models and the results. This is the baseline scenario. In the baseline scenario, by the way, I forgot to tell you that you can find both Turkish and English versions of the executive, quite large 32 pages of executive summary of this report in our website. If you Google Istanbul Policy Center and go to publications, then you can find it on top of this. So you will see all these numbers because I will be quite quick. In this base scenario, if you just want to see the highlights, that Turkey's real GDP growth rate in the first decade is average annual 3.7%. Then it goes down a little bit until 2070. But this is our main assumption about growth, economic growth. Annual average energy efficiency increase rate is 0.3% every year. Electricity demand increase rate also starts high in the first decade with 4.2%, then it goes down a little bit until 2070. And after all these assumptions, our annual electricity demand with 2.5% increase on average. As you know, it's in 2018, it's 300 terawatt hour, but it goes up to 770 terawatt hour in 2050. And from this, you know that in 2018, our emissions were around CO2 emissions, but not the greenhouse gas. CO2 emissions were 420 almost million tons, and it goes up to, in the baseline scenario, to more than 500 gigatons in 2030 and almost 700 million gigatons in, million tons in 2050. This is the breakdown according to sectors, and you see the increase, and you see the share of electricity is going up. The share of electricity and share of process emissions are going up with the years. And this is the baseline increase of our emissions. And this is the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. In the baseline scenario, it goes up to almost 900 million tons in 2050, but not more. That's important because in some assumptions, as you know, Turkey's emissions go more than 900, even in 2030. But in this macroeconomic assumptions and electricity demand assumptions, it goes up to 900, almost 900 million tons in 2050. Now, these are the important results from net zero scenario. In the net zero scenario, main assumptions are these. In the electricity sector, using maximum renewable capacity as fast as possible, decarbonizing electricity sector almost fully in 2050. And because we use a lot of renewable energy, then the flexibility needs of the grid is increasing. So that's why we included a lot of battery and pump hydro storage systems, and we used international interconnection capacity also for elasticity of the system, flexibility of the system. In the transportation sector, shifting from road to railways, shifting from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles are very important. We didn't use too much intervention for aviation. And we used a little bit behavioral change, but not too much, only 5% change, for example, not using cars, but using bicycles, etc. But we didn't include too much behavioral change, but a little bit we put also in the buildings. But in the buildings, electrification and using heat pumps are also the main assumption. And industry demand change is important. So you can find all these demand change assumptions in the report. Demand change, energy efficiency, electrification, direct renewable energy use, not in the high energy intensive sectors, but mostly in the low energy intensive sectors and services and agriculture, direct renewable energy use, and green hydrogen and CCS was included in our model only in a very small rate. We didn't put very ambitious new technologies to our study. This is our main results, actually. You see that if you don't include process emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions are going down to 74 million tons in 2050, with almost 80% reduction compared to 2018. If you include process emissions, because our interventions in the process emissions are not very strong, so we couldn't really decrease process emissions. If you include process emissions, then our residual emission in 2050 is 132 million tons with 70%, almost 70% reduction. These are our main results, and you see that this is the net zero scenario, the difference between baseline scenario and net zero scenario, and it corresponds to 70% decrease compared to 2018. I think this is the first such a graph about Turkey's emissions reduction. So that's an important, I think, graph. We have some details about the sectors. I will be very quick, but if you have questions, then we can talk about it later. Electricity sector is the sector that we really accomplished more than the average. So we reduce our emissions 90%, almost 90% in 2050 compared to 2018, and almost 50% reduction in 2030. That's important. And these are very complex, it seems, but main message here is this is the installed capacity baseline and net zero. You see that solar power installed capacity is going up and fossil fuel installed capacity is going down. It's the same for even more for the electricity production. And this is the difference between baseline and net zero scenario, that you see the orange one is solar power capacity is added a lot. And at the end in 2050, including hydro, in our study, hydro and other renewables are separated. But if you include hydro and other renewables together, so 90% of installed capacity and 90% of generation is coming from renewables in 2050. And this is the breakdown. We have one different extra scenario in electricity model, which is without nuclear power. But the difference in 2050 is very small. So if you have nuclear power, the residual emission from an electricity sector is 15 million tons. If you don't have nuclear power, it's 20 million tons, only 5 million tons more in the nuclear free scenario. But you can see the details later. This is the difference of battery and storage capacity, battery storage and pump hydro capacity between if you look at 2050, the orange one is net zero scenario, the blue one is baseline scenario. It's almost 13 times more storage capacity was assumed because of flexibility. In transport sector, our residual emission is 30 million tons with 65% reduction compared to 2018. And electrification is adding a lot of increased electricity demand in transportation model. And that is important because, as you see, the most of transport emissions are coming from freight transport, actually, heavy vehicles. And even in the, if you look at the residual emissions, the proportion of aviation is going up, proportionally it's going up, but still the majority is coming from freight transport. Buildings is the best result. We went down real zero in 2050 in buildings, mainly with the electrification of heating, cooking, etc. And it also adds electricity demand. Industry and other sectors, we reduced emissions 60% compared to 2018. Residual emission is 30 million tons. One thing important here is this is only energy-related industry emissions, but if you look at the process emissions, residual process emissions is close to 60 million tons. It's almost half of the residual emission in 2050 is coming from process emissions. Why? Because according to the international studies and literature, we didn't really find very good and realistic assumptions for process emissions. But if you really add better intervention techniques for process emissions, that can go down also. This is on the left, you see that process emissions in the baseline scenario, how it goes up. And gray part is cement industry, red part is iron and steel. So almost all process emissions are coming from these two high intensity energy intensity sectors. And this shows you how we can benefit from some intervention models in the industry emissions. In the early times, mostly from energy efficiency, but later on, demand reduction is more important. Finally, carbon budget. Our carbon budget was 7.95 gigatons. If you don't include process emissions, we are inside the carbon budget at the end, 7.4 gigatons. But if you include process emissions, it goes up to 9.4 gigatons. So we are exceeding, including the process emissions, we are exceeding carbon budget. We wanted to give more optimistic graph here. And these are the summary of what I said. 2018 is the big peak here in the net zero scenario. We go down to 132 million tons of residual emissions in 2050 with 13% less than 1990 level. And if you exclude process emissions, we go down to 74 million tons of CO2 with 43% less than 1990 level. But of course, don't use 1990 as the baseline year. Baseline year is 2018 in our study. And so if you include process emissions, it's 70% reduction. If you don't, 80% reduction. For the NDC, 2030 is important. In 2030, energy emissions are 37% reduced. All emissions, all CO2 emissions are 32% reduced. So this is the main message in terms of NDC, the new NDC of Turkey here. Of course, this is not energy economy-wide. So if you include methane and nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases, it's probably, it could be a little bit less, but then almost 30% reduction is in 2030 is our main message. Coal exit here is important. When can Turkey exit coal? In 2035, according to our net zero scenario. And electricity sector can be, electricity sector emissions can be 50% lower in 2030 compared to 2018. Gas exit, as I said before, in the electricity sector, the gas remains a little bit because of flexibility. But if we use better interventions like demand management. So we can even get rid of this 15 million tons of electricity sector residual emissions in 2050. Renewable energy installed capacity targets in the NDC can be 50% in 2030, excluding hydro. Okay, so solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass can be 50% in 2030. New renewable energy installation target can be 2.5 to 3 gigawatt each year to go up to 35 gigawatt in 2030. Remember, Turkey's current target is 1 gigawatt, so something like 2 to 3 times more than current target is feasible. E-vehicle target 20% in passenger cars and 10% in public and freight transport in 2030. Buildings target 50% reduction in 2030. And industry target is a little bit less, actually, around 25%, 26% in 2030. These are some discussion, but we can talk about them during the Q&A session. We, of course, in order to go down real zero to real net zero in 2050, we need to add some extra assumptions to this model. So because we couldn't go down exactly net zero, because our assumptions are quite conservative. So if you put more ambitious assumptions on the model, so you can probably get easier or sooner coal exit, and also you can go down to real net zero in 2050. So thank you for your attention. And for the Q&A session, we will also invite here our experts. Now, floor is yours, Volkan Bey.
Thank you.
Volkan Bey will present you about their study at A+.
Hello, everyone. I'm Volkan Yiğit. I'm a partner at R+ Energy in Turkey, Istanbul. We are a consulting and technology development firm specialized in the energy markets in the last 12 years. Over the last couple of years, we've been heavily involved in such studies that we carried out for NGOs. You see their names here listed. A wide range of NGOs have contributed to this project here. We'll look at the issue from another angle, like Ümit Bey mentioned. We set a goal to have Turkey's coal exits by 2030 or thereabouts. Now, the timeline is not predefined, but the results show us that it is actually achievable by 2030. Why? And similarly, we've started this study about a year ago and rushed a bit through the end to get things ready to this conference here. And at the time, of course, the ratification of the Paris Agreement by Turkish Parliament and the net zero target by 2053 wasn't there. But we said, first step, we laid out the foundations of the study as first step in the carbon pathway to carbon neutral Turkey. And obviously, one of the main emitters of Turkey, looking at electricity sector, are the coal power plants. So we started from here, inserted. Similarly, again, like minds think alike, the modeling perspective is on the basis somehow similar. We started with a business as usual scenario, mainly looking at the targets of Turkey. The Ministry of Energy sets out to install 1 gigawatt of solar and 1 gigawatt of wind every year from today onwards. And we see that in our business as usual scenario. In the business as usual scenario, we also have the nuclear power plant becoming online in 2025 and onwards, 1 unit each year. This is a power plant under construction. So we put this in the business as usual scenario because it's already 2 years in the making. And we generally focus on the outcomes of each scenario on the installed capacity development, the generation mix, carbon dioxide emissions. Again, no other emitters are included in this study. And unit price of electricity generation. So what are we going to pay if we are to go into a carbon neutral electricity market? And we look at the system cost, including the transmission investments that we need to do if we want to include a vast amount of renewable energy. These are the details. I won't bore you with them, but just in briefly, as this business as usual scenario, like I said, everything is as planned today. Actually not today, but maybe 6-9 months ago, when the carbon, the net zero ambitions, the targets were not there. So first things first, we looked at the coal phase out scenario. This is an econometric model, an iterative model that we carried out in-house. A fundamental market model approach was taken. And in order to facilitate an exit in the coal market, coal power plants, of course, there needs to be an element to be inserted in the electric sector, and this is the carbon price. So the polluter pays for the price of this pollution, and it changes, it transits the energy market overall into another level. So as in the business as usual scenario, the Akkuyu nuclear power plant under construction is also here included in the coal phase out scenario. One thing that is that we omitted in the final scenario, coal phase out without nuclear scenario, is the omission of nuclear as it stands. So what we looked at, basically the elements, the factors that go into making a projection on the electricity market. So we looked at electricity demand and the relationship with GDP growth. We're being also quite conservative, especially on the GDP side. If you look at it, it's roughly averaging 3.5 over the forecast period. And we're adding in the EV consumption to ramp up. And also we're including a national, in line with the national energy efficiency plan of Turkey, we're including an efficiency factor in the electricity demand projections. The most important part, as I mentioned, carbon cost. And here we base our assumptions on the IEA forecast of 2020 for Europe. So it's US dollars per ton in real dollar terms. It's going, we start implementing it gradually. In 2025, we have a full implementation. So 100% of the carbon cost is applied on the generation assets. Last 1-2 months, the main focus we had was on the volatility of the commodity markets, obviously. So we had some slight changes in the short term. We look at the imported coal price and natural gas price, and we see there are spikes overall, like in Europe. The Turkish market is affected by the increases in the commodity prices. But going forward on the long-term projections, we do stick with the World Bank forecast because they're a reliable source when it comes to commodity price forecasting. And again, they are quite conservative in the sense to, I mean, if you put in a bigger coal price or a natural gas price, the exit would be easier, sooner. And we're not following that road. We're being more conservative, like I said. And the capacity capex numbers, these are from IRENA. So we want to be as international, we want to provide international references. I won't bore you with these. So these are mainly the idea or the projection is that the capex, capital expenditures of wind and solar are going down. Again, not really optimistic, but they are going down. The same stands for the battery storage, lithium-ion storages that we inserted in our scenarios. And the main results of Turkey's exit possibilities from coal. And one thing before giving the results maybe is that I need to mention Turkey is now providing coal power plants two dimensions of advantages. One is including them in the capacity mechanism. That's that pays out a remuneration for the power plants. And the second is that the Turkish national state electricity company is buying half of the local coal power generation at a fixed price inflated by the factors included in the contract. So we're scrapping these off. First, again, we're scrapping any inclusion in the capacity mechanism. So if they can stand feasible in the market environment, market perspective, so they stay. But over the years, with the increase, with the first inclusion and then the increase of carbon cost, it becomes inevitable for them to shut down one by one based on their efficiency levels, based on their coal cost internally. So that's how we look at things. Total installed power by the end of 2035 is around 150 gigawatt in the business as usual scenario. Like I said, the business as usual scenario is not as optimistic as ours in the line of renewable energy capacity inclusions, because in the total installed wind and solar capacity, we're looking at 60 gigawatt in business as usual scenario. Our coal phase out scenario says you need 101 gigawatts of capacity, total capacity, and a nuclear-free, non-nuclear scenario is at 112 gigawatt. So what it brings us, basically, is the share of wind and solar. This is what we look at as the most important factor, is increasing from 30%, 29% to 51 in coal phase out scenario and 56% in nuclear free coal phase out scenario. If you also include the hydros, runoff river and storage hydros, this number is around 50% in business as usual scenario, but it goes up to almost 80% by 2035 in a nuclear free coal phase out scenario. The sector emissions are down from 140 million tons of carbon dioxide to around 28 and 33 million tons of carbon dioxide. So it's a steep decrease in the sector emissions. Average electricity generation unit price is overall during the forecast period, because in the inclusion of carbon cost is of course making, has some remedies for the consumers, but overall, because these power plants, these new power plants, the renewables are not based on any feed-in tariff, but gets commissioned by the market's perspective. So the overall changes slightly. And what we have on the contrary, on the other side, is that we also are collecting a sum from this carbon cost pricing. So if you use that carbon income, let's say, that will bring our total cost, total investment cost even closer. And that's I think a fair assumption, fair amount to pay for such a big transition in Turkey. Some more details, if you look at it, in the local coal sites, remembering that most of these power plants have been privatized earlier on in the last decade. They're phasing out slightly starting from 2026, going down to 2029, and by 2030, we do not have a local coal power plant in our forecast scenarios. The similar implications for imported coal, they exist in 2028 because local coal, they pay a bigger price for carbon cost per megawatt hours, but the cost of coal on an import coal side adds up to it. So it's a bit, they leave the system 1 year earlier than the local coals. Total of wind and solar installed capacity, you say in the business as usual scenario, after 2030, it becomes difficult to commission new power plants because the market prices are lower than the expected levels of feasible renewable power plants. So you either need to provide them a feed-in tariff. We do not include that here in the business as usual scenario, or you simply put in the carbon cost, and that makes the transition accordingly. Share of renewables increasing year by year, going up to 78% in 2035, and 2030 is another, of course, important milestone. Roughly 75% in our non-nuclear phase-out scenario is renewable. So that's a great accomplishment for the whole system. Again, similar to Sabancı University study, we include a substantial capacity in battery storage, and the investment costs of these battery storages are included in the total investment cost for flexibility reasons, of course. And likewise, the natural gas power plants, we keep them in the system. We do not exit from natural gas, but the utilization rates of these power plants are switching more to a peaker position. So they meet the demand in peak times rather than running on full load at all times as a baseload power plant. So their utilization rates decrease over the years. Unit cost of electricity, again, the gray line in the middle is the average scenario we can look at, is a coal phase-out scenario. If you look at the investment costs, that's not working, sorry. In 2025 to 2028, this is the inclusion, this is the money spent on nuclear. So carbon dioxide emissions, again, starts to drop from 2025 down to, in 2030, actually, we reach a very stable and green level in carbon dioxide emissions, and we keep pushing forward. The revenues from carbon pricing, the difference between the money collected on the emitters is increasing until 2030, increasing in the beginning, and of course decreasing as they phase out these power plants that pay the carbon cost. This is us in a nutshell. I've tried to be as fast as possible. Any questions we'll take in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hocalarımızı alabilir miyiz ekrana? Okay, thank you. Şu anda çalışıyor mu? Evet, bu burada dursa bir şey olmaz herhalde. Okay. So our research team, actually our professors from each sector model, let me say, are here to answer your questions. Osman Bey for the transportation model, Bora Hoca for the electricity model, Kemal Bey for buildings, and Ebru Hoca for the industry and macroeconomic model. So if you have questions, please ask, and I can answer, or they can answer your questions. You can also ask questions to Volkan Bey. Please.
Thank you for this detailed presentation. I'm Javed Gilani from Pakistan, representing an international organization, Muslim Hands, which is UK West. So it is not a question, rather a comment. You know, I want to learn from this. So implementing anything, you need first thing is the ownership at all levels. So when I see it from the government level, and then from the private sector, and also all the industries, and then taking it to the household level. So how you are ensuring the Turkish government that this plan is embedded into your country development plan first, and you further how you're taking it to the public, you know, the awareness and sensitization to take the ownership, and further the industry, which you see other way around. So everybody is there seeing earning, and how that is going to give, you know, them incentive rather than, you know, they are not earning more what they are at the moment. So again, you know, sensitization embedded into the plan, country development plan, committed, how community will be sensitized, how they are going to take over. Like, take my example. If I am sitting in Pakistan, my house, I'm getting electricity. So who is going to invest? Me, if there is nothing coming from the public sector or any other. So I'm not going to change the electricity to the solar panel. So this is what I see as a comment, and also what plan is there for the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, this question is a little bit beyond the scope of this study, but maybe Roja or other experts can answer.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you. I think that's a very important point that our contributor raised. But as Ümit Bey mentioned, this is a very first step study to fill out the technicalities of how to reach net zero by 2050 in Turkey. The next step is, of course, how to implement this. And as you suggested, the implementation needs immense design of policy, not only in terms of incentives to firms and private households and everybody, every decision maker, but also like taxes, like different types of subsidies, like quotas, like carbon pricing policies altogether. So what we need to do to complement this technical study is to look at the feasibility in terms of the feasibility of all these policies here, or the feasibility of all the suggestions here on the policy ground. That's a very valid point. Thank you.
I can also add some.
Yes.
In addition to what Dr. Ebru has mentioned, we also need infrastructures for implementation of the net zero carbon emission by 2050, particularly for the transportation sector, because in our transportation sector, the key assumptions include electrification of the household cars and also freight transportation. And main benefits or main savings from carbon emission is coming from electrification of the transportation by switching to railway, which is also electrified. So for example, for freight transportation, switching to electric-based railway transportation requires infrastructure of electrified railways network in the country. In Turkey, there are some studies on that. I mean, there are some projects ongoing for electrification of the railway network, but it should expedite and continue in order to make people who are in freight and household transportation encouraging to, you know, switching to electric cars or transportation or on railway systems. So infrastructure by government is significant.
Teşekkürler. Thank you. Mithat Bey, buyurun. Mikrofon, gezici mikrofon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Şahin. I would like to express my most sincere thanks for a very comprehensive presentation. It's really impressive. My name is Mithat Rende. I'm the former climate change negotiator, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. My question has to do with the phasing out of coal in Turkey, which seems to be quite difficult. First of all, we need a political will to do it, of course, and then we have to deal with the social and economic consequences of phasing out coal-fired power plants and also coal mines. So I understand that the European Union has decided, or they decided to allocate $150 billion initially to deal with the social consequences in order to support the households and the families who would be in dire situations. So would you be able to, for example, consider EU support in phasing out coal-fired power plants in Turkey? It's quite a huge sector. And how could we deal with the lobbies, with the coal lobby, because they seem to be quite strong in Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can ask first Boroja. I don't know, or Ebroja, do you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe I have to. First of all, thank you for this question. This is a very important issue. Maybe I will repeat what Ebroja said for the previous question. Yeah, this study is to understand the limitations of the country, limitations of our country, whether it will be possible to obtain a net zero, whether it is technically feasible or not. But we know that we need policies to transform or for making such a transition, and there will be social issues, there will be socio-economic impacts of this transformation, this transition. But this was not in the scope of our study, but there are some studies, recent studies on the socio-economic impacts of energy transition. Of course, there will be an important role of the government for this transition. Maybe Ebroja can add more on this topic.
Well, thank you. The only thing I can add is that we didn't study the socioeconomic impacts or the regional impacts of the coal phase out, but there's a recent study by Cntr together with Sefia that looks into the employment, the socioeconomic and the regional impacts. So I think that's a study that would complement the technicalities here. Thank you.
I'd like to add one thing and then to give the floor to Osman Bey for this. I think one of the most crucial parts of this study, especially in the electricity sector model, that we used a market simulation model here. So one of the oppositions coming from the energy sector is the unreliable renewable energy capacity, right? So it's always like that. But in this study, we used two models at the same time or consequently for the electricity sector model. So it's really strong in this side. Maybe Osman Bey, you can tell us a little bit about how you use this hourly model about market.
Sure. Actually, our modeling approach is based on communication or interaction between two main models. One model is a long-term investment model for power sector, which is run by Bora Hoca on the screen, and it is optimizing the generation technologies based on investment costs, operational costs, etc. And once we get long-term results from this long-term capacity optimization algorithm, we test the results by market simulation in hourly resolution, like the day-ahead market in Turkey. And the day-ahead market in Turkey simulation means that in case of high amount of renewables, every hour our model is testing whether the system can work or not with such amount of renewable generation under phase out, coal phase out. And and we solved that in our simulation model, particularly during some holiday periods like Ramadan periods or religious holiday periods, when the demand is so low because of the excess generation in renewables, the system is getting very under stress significantly, and the solution could be either curtailment of the renewable generation or storing it. Vice versa, when the demand is so high and renewable generation is not so available, let's say, during some periods, then load shedding is indispensable, or we should use storage devices or interconnections more effectively to mitigate such load sheddings. At the end, in our model, we put storage devices and flexible interconnections with other countries as a backup for such mitigations of renewable curtailment and load shedding. And the model gives, the model converts if and only if we have some installed capacity of storage devices and flexible interconnections. And actually, this is very obvious because when we look at Germany, for example, they are benefiting from the strong interconnections with the neighbor countries, so that during some periods, they are generating more from renewables more than their demand even. And they are benefiting the interconnections as a flexible issue. For example, the interconnections means that infinite batteries, particularly if you are an excess of generation from the renewables, immediately they are feeding to the other countries. Or if you are lack of generation, the interconnections are feeding to you immediately. So they are infinite storage devices. But as we mentioned in our study, the volumes of such storage devices and flexible interconnections we need to install somehow to cope with technical issues introduced by coal phase out. For socially, this is beyond the scope of the project, but as Ebru Hoca mentioned, there are other studies which can complement. For example, one of the studies is running by Institute of Advanced Sustainable Studies from Germany, and the name of the project is Co-Benefits. And this Co-Benefits project already focus on which kind, the potential of social benefits from increasing in renewables and phasing out from the coal. Okay, some lobbies are losing, okay, and also some workers are losing in this big industry sector, but the increase in renewables also introduces significant working area and sector for the workers as well. So this should be somehow considered in the future in judging the negative impacts of coal phase out, let's say.
Thank you, Osman Bey. Volkan Bey, do you want to say something about coal phase outs question?
We also received some similar questions, both from socioeconomic perspective and also the concerning the debt of coal power plants as it stands, the financial situation they're in. So like you mentioned, the funds is something that we put forward as a possibility to benefit from, to enable the closure of these power plants, to share, or I don't know, share by how much between parties, between banks, between the investor, between the government, but there needs to be a right approach taken forward. And I think the social studies, at some point, we will link these with our analytical approaches, so they will go hand in hand, and we will find the right solution together.
Thank you.
Jean.
Thank you very much for Dr. Şahin and the team. Very qualified team brought together. So you started to thank you very much for this. And regarding the gentleman's question, what about the decision makers? Are they willing to do part of this, take part over here and implement the results received? Now this is with International Renewable Energy Agency, with, you know, maybe International Renewable Energy of the United Nations. Now the solution has somebody defending in the United Nations. So they are doing socioeconomic studies now. If we go earlier switch, what will be the benefit? If we input $1 today, then this will come as $5 back with the benefits and everything. So the socioeconomic studies are being made, and my colleagues are also aware of this. The second thing is European Green Deal is the target for Turkey. Turkey is going to be a part, still benefiting from this. So the European Green Deal directives, the direction is our motto, and all the bodies, including the government bodies, industry, are arranging themselves accordingly. to do, what to do, how to market their things, how to export. So this is the guiding principle. But the thing is this, there should be some innovations made because we are switching from past to the future. So the future needs innovations. It's not big power plants, now distributed generation. So all the structure is to be moved. And there are 4 types of innovations. One is business plans, the market design. Third one is the organization by the utilities and things. And the 4th is the enabling technologies, which are 12 of them, blockchain, artificial something. So, but the problem is not the central governments, it will start from the cities. So it is the cities, and the cities are getting ready for this. And Istanbul, Izmir, and all of our cities are getting ready for their climate energy action plans. And the cities will handle this problem. And when they solve the problem locally, the national problem would be in a position, because as renewables go, everybody needs to adjust themselves according to that. I want to just edit this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yanınızı hocam yana verebilirsiniz.
Thank you for these very interesting presentations. I'm Ayşen Mert, and I'm a lecturer at Stockholm University. And as a political scientist, I want to ask you a little bit of a more ambiguous and more political question. You seem to have imagined the future with these models. What actors seem to be becoming more important if Turkey decides to decarbonize, and if the political will is there, if the strategy is made, which actors become more important to both economically and politically to convince, excuse me, and which actors become more vulnerable in terms of losing their livelihoods and so forth, other than the mining communities who were already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is also a little bit beyond the scope of the study, but let me ask our team if they want to answer. Any contribution?
Ümit Bey, maybe you can answer the political will side, and then
okay, I will. But
and then perhaps.
Yeah. But yes, please. Okay. In this study there is no answer, of course. This is a general question, because you really, in terms of this study, in order to answer this kind of questions, you really need to make more socioeconomic studies, which actors will be more impacted, affected, etc., etc. The only thing, just by looking at the results, of course, energy sector is more important. Energy bureaucracy is more important in terms of policy making here. Industry is really important, because you saw in the results that electricity sector and buildings and transportations may be a little bit easy to solve, but industry is not, because they need more innovation, they need more new technologies, especially for the process emissions, etc. So industry's role, big industrialists' role is probably very big. But also don't forget about the citizens, because if you want to really shift so fast from, for example, from passenger cars, normal passenger cars to e-cars, or from road transport to railway transport, investments are not sufficient. You also need some will from the people, right? So we really need people's readiness for this. So I don't really believe personal lifestyle changes in climate change, but I believe that readiness of the citizens for change is very important. I think maybe this can be said in terms of.
My question is on that. You mentioned that the building sector is the easiest way to achieve net zero targets. So what's the measures that you applied for for your combination to, to show that this result?
Thank you for the question, because I really didn't have time to show you all the assumptions in all sectors. So for all sectors, the main assumptions are very important, but Kemal Bey probably will answer in more detail about buildings.
Sure. Thank you. Actually, we have based our model on Ministry of Environment's baseline studies on building technology map. Main assumptions for the urban, for the building renovation and demolition rates. So they should be increased maybe 3 or 4 times more than the current situation. Other assumptions were transition from coal to natural gas first, and also from natural gas to electricity, improvement in building energy performance, and also use of heat pumps, and especially by maybe 2040s, adding hydrogen for space heating. When we look at the current building stock of Turkey, we see that nearly 1/3 of the building stock is classified as inefficient or old buildings. So especially these urban transformation projects constitute a big opportunity for the saving. Also, after the legislation in 2008, we see that most of the building have been actually built according to the new legislation, but nearly 90–95% of those buildings have energy level C. So there is also a big opportunity in improving the average energy performance level. So those are the main, let's say, highlights from our study.
Thank you, Kemal Bey. Let me add something in general about these assumptions. What we did here in the study in all sectors mostly are about the transition, energy transition, and using clean technologies. We didn't really use too much lifestyle changes, etc. Of course, all these changes need lifestyle changes, but mainly we really kept the structure of Turkish economy quite the same. So you have the same macroeconomic assumptions, you have the same, for example, increasing motorization rate in the transportation sector is the same in the baseline scenario. So we don't assume in this study a really ecological lifestyle in 30 years, for example, because we wanted to show that only by using this technological and mainly energy transition and transition in other sectors can bring us to some point. But of course, we couldn't go to zero, net zero here. So after that, we will need maybe more ambitious changes, not only technologically, but also in more ecologic lifestyle, etc. But for buildings, for example, for buildings and for partially for transportation, etc., why, and also for the electricity sector, why it was easier? Because we had technology, we had heat pumps, for example, we had electricity, and we had easier, transition was easier for renewables, because renewables are now the cheapest way of electricity generation. And for example, electric vehicles will be the new normal in probably in 10 years. So this is our main assumption. I think in this study, the most important part is maybe this kind of studies should be repeated with different groups, different agencies, different universities, and also the ministries, that to compare each other in terms of both assumptions and for the outcomes. İzzet Bey. I think this is the last question. Then after we will finalize. Yes.
Thank you, Ümit Bey. İzzet Arı, Social Science University of Ankara. I want to thank all participants and panelists. That was great study. And it's an opportunity to take this study to compare our current studies. My question about the carbon budget, you know that the IPCC released last August sixth assessment scientific reports, and it tells about the total carbon budget by 2050, around 460 gigatons. And I saw your presentation around 7.4 or 7.95 gigaton.
For Turkey.
Yeah, around that. And it's very important, but what is the main assumption while taking these carbon budgets for Turkey? Did you assume nature-based or ecosystem-based approaches while calculating this carbon budget, or just energy-related emissions for this total budget? Because it's important, Turkey already announced net zero targets by 2053. We will try to reach these targets. I want to ask that question. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Really, it's really important. What the carbon budget that we used here is coming from the not from the IR6. It's coming from 2008 1.5 special report of IPCC. Why? Because we started doing this study last year, so the IR6 was not there, and also our base year is 2018. So the carbon budget in special report 1.5 special report is from 2018. That's why the global carbon budget in our study is 580 gigatons for 50% possibility to stay below 1.5 degrees. And out of this, you could find several ways to allocate Turkey's carbon budget. You could basically keep the percentage same, for example. If you look at today, but by the way, this is not greenhouse gas budget, this is carbon budget only, right? So CO2. So in terms of, for example, with an approach, you can take the share of Turkey's emissions, annual emissions, this year, for example, in the global emissions. That would be 1.2% or something like that, right? So you can keep this 1.2% in the 580 and you can get some result. But that wouldn't be really fair for Turkey, because Turkey's developmental rights, let me put it like this, is more than, right, the UK, for example. So you cannot equalize the UK and Turkey. So that's why we used an approach we called CPC. I showed this, I think you were a little bit late. So in the beginning I showed, I will give you this is a methodology coming from Paris Equity Check, and it's based on IPCC principle, equality principle. So it means that at the end, cumulative per capita emissions will be equal for all countries in the total global carbon budget. So for Turkey, Turkey's cumulative per capita carbon emissions is lower, of course, than the developed countries. So Turkey's share in the carbon budget is a little bit higher than today's share in the annual global emissions. So at the end, our 7.95 gigatons corresponds to 1.37% of the global carbon budget, not 1.2. 14% more, let's say, emission rights we allocated to Turkey. Okay, so that's very important question. So in all studies, I think this fair share and equity principles should be observed. I don't know, Ebru Hocam, if you want to add something about that.
Thank you, but this is quite important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you for all the questions and all your participation, and I think we can close our event. And okay, çok çabuk gitti. Evet, çok teşekkürler hocam. Görüşmek üzere herkese.